Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Attire seminar. This is part of an ongoing series at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. I'm in Cape Town, South Africa, and today's guest, Paolo Garbaudo, is in London, where he's enthusiastically supporting the football today, and otherwise is a senior lecturer at King's College London in digital culture and society in the Department of Digital Humanities. And he is also the director of the Center for Digital Culture at King's College in London. So the subject of Paolo's talk today is based on the text which we circulated before the seminar, which looks at digital hermeneutics. The title of the paper is From Data Analytics to Data Hermeneutics, Online Political Discussions, Digital Methods, and the Continuing Relevance of Interpretive Approaches. And so this is going to be an example of Paolo's approach in which he looks at the diffusion of big data techniques in recent scholarship on political behavior. And he's proposing that this has led to a quantitative bias in the understanding of online political phenomena and a disregard for issues of content and meaning. So just with that brief introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Paolo to give a presentation which says more about the paper and the information around it. And then following that, we will have a discussion. And I know that many of my colleagues here at HUMA are really interested in this issue, and they also work in this realm. To do with online politics and digital spread of information and the digital humanities. So I know you have people here really interested in what you have to say, as well as people logged in from other parts of the world and other institutions. So thank you very much, Paolo. Please take it away.
Yes, thanks very much, Ralph, and thanks very much to all the people at HUMA for this invitation. I'm very glad that I can share some of my research with you, and perhaps this can allow us, since we are working on similar issues, to reflect on some of the problems of contemporary research in this area. I mean, this is not to say an attempt to say that all data analytics is wrong or all quantitative research is wrong, obviously, but to say that there are problems now in scholarship that have to do with some illusions about big data analysis as somehow something that is automatic or automated, which tends to sideline the need for more interpretive and more qualitative approaches. While what I think that the need there is really some synergy between quantitative and qualitative approaches. So starting point is really that many of us, I guess many of the people in this room, what we do is studying content on social media, and social media for researchers is really a treasure trove with millions of posts written every minute, terabytes of information produced every week. But I think that despite the enormous scholarship that has developed in this area, it is as if we still know little about what to actually do with all this material. And sometimes there is a bit of a tendency to accumulate data, millions of tweets, right, as you see mentioned in many papers, but without really having a clear idea of what we are actually analyzing. And so what do these data sets represent? And secondly, how we can extract meaning from these data sets. So what we're facing here is really a methodological challenge, in the sense that in every era, when there are new phenomena, one of the most challenging questions is methodology. That is, how do we deal with this phenomena, and how do we deal with data? And the problem with big data is that often, as the word says, is literally the huge quantity of this data, the huge dimension of this data, millions of rows, tens of millions of data points, which seems to be beyond the grasp or the ability or the analytical ability of traditional methodologies, and especially of qualitative methodologies, right? Because qualitative methodologies are usually quite bad at analyzing big things. Qualitative methodologies are at their best when they are analyzing something that is very focused and in a way very limited. Say, for example, a text, a book, rather than an entire library, or some interviews rather than an entire population that has been interviewed by means of surveys. Yet at the same time, I think it is very important to recognize the continuing importance of qualitative methodologies. On the one hand, because they unlock questions having to do with motivations, having to do with meaning, having to do with understanding that quantitative methodologies are not designed to address, but also because also quantitative analysis always have a qualitative element. Right? I mean, for example, when one is defining certain categories of analysis in a survey, those categories, right, the names that are used or the questions that are posed to people are always qualitative issues, right? I mean, it changes a lot whether one is defining something in a certain way or another. And recently doing more quantitative work, I came to realize this more and more, right? How important is a clear understanding of the categories, which is by its nature a qualitative process. So the question is really, how can we navigate this field of abundance, sometimes overabundance, in a way that is effective, meaningful, and economic, in the sense that doesn't overwhelm our cognitive abilities and doesn't overwhelm our time. So in terms of methodological innovation, we know that there's been a lot of development in terms of research methods using big data. For example, analysis of Twitter and Facebook conversations, connected with social movements and political parties. And this usually works through a number of steps, typically collection of online data, analysis of this data, and often methods of visualization and topological analysis that try to analyze this data, as, for example, using Gephi, right, which is one of the most popular softwares that are utilized to look at how networks are constructed, what shapes they have. And often these type of research can show us something interesting, for example, different groups or subgroups within a conversation, say a highly politicized conversation, for example, on masks or lockdowns, right, which is now a big issue of contention in many countries the world over. Perhaps it can show us what are the different positions around these issues, what are the different groups, the different communities that are forming. But sometimes, I mean, something that I find quite annoying of some network visualizations is that they are just too complex. They have too many nodes. They tend towards this aesthetic of complexity for complexity's sake, almost, where it's very hard to understand what we are actually learning from something like this, right? This is a network analysis of Occupy Wall Street networks, besides the fact that it is complex, right? Besides the fact that, hey, you need to look at all these different actors and all these different accounts, all these different channels on social media. So the first problem is really kind of this aesthetic of complexity for complexity's sake that sometimes really seems to evade the question of explanation, which I think is a fundamental duty for researchers, more so social researchers. So it is not enough to say we want to map the world, right, which would be perhaps the Latourian type of attitude. In a sense, I just want to show how the world is. But we really need to explain what are the driving factors, what are the dominant factors, dominant processes there. And that requires some degree of simplification. That requires some degree of identifying a limited number of factors that can explain how things are working. So there is also a problem with sampling, often that is, I think, quite overlooked. I mean, I've seen articles that were analyzing certain phenomena using the wrong hashtag, because evidently the researcher didn't know enough about a given movement or about a given party, perhaps a party in another country using another language that the researcher was not familiar with. And in this kind of cottage industry of research papers on digital society, digital politics, sometimes you also have quite gross mistakes at the very basic level of sampling data that is actually relevant to the question you want to analyze. I mean, one example, I saw analysis of social movements in Egypt that were analyzing the Egypt hashtag, which was not the hashtag that Egyptians were using. It was the hashtag that people in the US and the UK were using on Twitter to comment on events in Egypt. So it's like whatever, studying a phenomenon, studying internal discussions, but using the hashtag that is used outside of the country as if it was the same used within the country. There's often a tendency to operate on false assumption about the role of a certain social media channel in a given movement or political party. I mean, for example, there is an overrepresentation of Twitter research that is not justified by the actual impact of Twitter, because we know that Facebook has many more users than Twitter. Though academics, alike journalists and other kind of social and cultural professionals tend to be quite in love with Twitter and quite familiar with Twitter. So sometimes they tend to study Twitter much more than what would you say, than an objective analysis would suggest. Let's say if in this day and age, if on social media still to this day, let's say it's 80% Facebook, 20% Twitter. I mean, leaving all the other social media aside, research is almost the contrary. It's kind of 20% Facebook and 80% Twitter, which I find quite curious. And I mean, and also because it is not kind of accounted for or justified. I mean, one could say I study Twitter over Facebook because of this reason. Perhaps one may say it is easier to get data from Twitter, right? But this is not rationalized. And the biggest problem is that often there is no contextualization actually of these kind of research, in a sense. This is really the big problem, in the sense that people like Anderson of Wire magazine are contributing to popularizing this notion that with big data fundamentally doesn't require a theoretical model anymore, in the sense that you can simply deduce information from the mathematical patterns within the data set. And that leads sometimes to sloppy contextualization. In the sense, the fact that within research teams, there is not enough expert knowledge about the countries that are analyzed, about the phenomena that are analyzed, the movements, the parties, the individuals involved, and so on and so forth. And often there is also in this kind of network analysis, I think often debates the question of what are actually the communication centers in this network. Because one of the problems with the notion of network is the idea that there's no center anymore. Everything is potentially a center. But I think that when one analyzes concrete social and political phenomena, one sees that that is not actually the case, that often there are centers, there are focuses in the communication network, and it is actually very important to address them and to explain them. So this is a bit like a negative part. Then I will go with, I will offer you also some, perhaps some, if not some solutions, some ideas towards a solution of these problems. I mean, another problem is that social media are a form of communication, and communication is a symbolic process. Right? It is a language. Therefore, it is obvious that for analyzing something that is symbolic, you need some expertise on symbolic processes, right, which is eminently qualitative. So a general problem we have, which as already anticipated a bit before, is this sheer quantity of data available. Qualitative methods are designed for small data, as Nick Coldry has argued in a paper some years ago. Why with social media, typically what we get is big data. I mean, that is partly because we often feel compelled to have the entire picture. Actually, there are ways in which small data can be sourced from social media. For example, by focusing on specific Twitter accounts or Facebook accounts, rather than trying to capture the entire conversation. But again, the typical Twitter conversation in its totality would be millions of tweets, and really the problem there is how we sample that. So what I propose in this journal article that was circulated before this seminar is what I describe as digital hermeneutics. I mean, hermeneutics, as we know, is fundamentally the science of interpretation. What it suggests is that in order to understand reality, starting from texts of different kinds, be they books or films, or in this day and age, social media conversations, we need to go deeper, right? We cannot content ourselves with a kind of face value, with a superficial analysis, but we have instead to unearth the deep meaning structures that underpin texts. For example, the different assumptions that the author or authors of certain communications made, the kind of imaginary that was involved there, the references, right, intertextual references to other texts. And in order to do that, typically in literary criticism, and then in semiotics, in cultural analysis, in cultural studies, the procedure that was utilized was this called close reading. And what close reading is, I mean, the phrase really says it all. It's a process where we take a piece of text, right? For example, this book by Williams. We focus perhaps not even on the book, but on a chapter, and we try to really interpret in depth what is meant by everything. So when it comes to social media, doing close reading is very difficult because, again, you're overwhelmed with all this overabundance of textual material. But there are ways in which we can filter social media information. Because what we know is that social media conversations are not a space where everyone is equal. It's not true that nobody knows if you are a dog online, as the famous meme put it. And it is not true as what Hillary Clinton said around the time of the Arab Spring, actually in 2010, as part of the so-called internet freedom agenda, that online everyone can become a star or a celebrity. It doesn't matter if you are a pop musician or whatever, an actor, whatever the case may be, everyone can suddenly explode. I mean, it is true that influencers, YouTubers have shown that also people completely deprived of any skill or any apparent skill can, because of some strange chemistry, be projected into the limelight of celebrity. But these people are very, very few. Online is a space which has a very steep power distribution. So power distribution fundamentally means the distribution of resources, in this case visibility, across the units of a given system. A steep power distribution is one in which few units control the majority of the resources within the system. On social media, the case is people like us, say, who will have at most, whatever, thousands of followers or hundreds of followers or less than that. And then people like Justin Bieber or Rihanna or Elon Musk, right, with millions of followers. And what that means is that that unevenness, that inequality in visibility is reflected in inequality in the visibility of posts, right, of individual units in these conversations. Meaning that, for example, say in an hashtag around the US election, Republican hashtag, say the MAGA hashtag, the tweets by Donald Trump will have 100 times or 1,000 times the visibility of the fans of Donald Trump that have much less visibility. So what that suggests is that actually, when we look at a social media conversation, we don't really need to look at the entirety of the conversation, either quantitatively or qualitatively. We can instead decide to focus on a tinier, more manageable subset of the conversation that allows us to look more in depth at the actual content of the conversation. It allows us to look at what people are discussing, the issues, or to look at the language people are using, the slogans, the imagery, right, the visual material people are using. So to do that, we can do what I describe here as one of the sampling methods, top sampling, right? Sampling for the top contents within a data set based on a number of metrics, for example, the number of shares or the number of retweets. For example, in a conversation of millions of tweets, we can decide perhaps to concentrate on the top 50 messages in terms of the visibility they have. Or we can sample based on the temporality of a conversation. I mean, there are peaks in conversations that are often really the moments when things happen. And we can decide temporarily to focus on a slice in time within the data set, or a random sampling if we instead say we want to look really at a conversation that is not as organized from above, or we want to get more of a sense of the kind of grassroots conversation going on. We may decide, for example, to sample, to have a random sample, right, which is very easy now with any software from a data set, and say, all right, I'm going to look at these 50 random tweets from this data set and see if I can, if they allow me to understand a bit more what is the culture there, right? What is going on. For example, in Italy, there is this weird subculture now on Twitter called the mattonisti, the brick people. It's basically sort of anti-woke. It's a sort of the Italian adaptation of the warm walk, right? Basically, people who are close to the alt-right. I mean, one could, for example, choose one of the hashtags of this group and download the sample and then kind of concentrate on a subset of that and try to use that to understand a bit better the language these people are using in order to understand the culture of this online tribe, as it were. So top sampling really is about kind of choosing the top 50, 100, 200, I mean, as many as you want and as is manageable for you. I mean, this is really kind of more of a rule of thumb than a strict advice. And that is good, again, to get a sense of what the most popular messages were in a given conversation and what was the dominant language imaginary there. Peak sampling, as I explained before, is focusing on messages taking place in a given period of time, the day of the election or of an important protest event. And again, random sampling, as I explained a bit before, is a procedure where we try to find, where we are focusing on a tinier subset to do this close reading. So again, close reading is a key method of qualitative, key element of qualitative methods. For example, it means taking a poster, say a propaganda poster, and really trying to go beyond the immediate impression and try to understand why a certain visual was used, why a certain color was used, right? Why a certain slogan was used. The idea that with close reading is to immerse ourselves in a text, to study it in great depth, to spot the recurrence of certain words, the presence of certain images, references, themes, so on and so forth. This is a work that by its nature can only be done manually. I mean, we don't have at this point in time tools, software that can do this as well as a human being can do, because we know that automated analysis is very bad precisely to do this, to appreciate context. So for example, think about sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis is to this day still quite rusty, quite bad at actually capturing the sentiment of a conversation. And partly it is because it cannot understand irony. Right? For example, people joking where the sentiment would be positive, but actually, if one reads it and understands it, it is negative, right? And our analysis software that we have at the moment is quite bad at capturing these elements. So there's different levels of reading social media material. Social media material should be read at different levels. One is reading a post in a data set, reading a post as part of a broader conversation, reading a post within a kind of cultural and ideological context in which that post is located, right? And doing this, I think actually it's a good exercise. I mean, it sounds trivial, but actually some posts have such an enormous effect in terms of mobilizing people that sometimes just focusing on a single post or on a small number of posts is actually a very good exercise to try to capture what is actually behind that, right? So for example, looking at the text of the post, comparing it with the ones next to it, trying to understand whether it is similar to other posts, whether there is a common strategy, a common rhetoric used across different posts, which terms are recurring, how it is specific, how it is different, and so on and so forth. Reading a post in a conversation is instead looking at the text and how it combines with other messages, how it responds, because we know that one of the key features of online conversations is the interactive element, how people are reacting to that and interacting with it, and what kind of conversation is developing out of that. And finally, reading a post in a broader cultural and ideological system it is part of. For example, I have colleagues who are working on the alt-right online, and for them it is essential not just to read the post, but to read the books these people are reading, right? De Gobineau and other theorists of racism, or many kind of founding texts of the far right or or the new right. I mean, these are things that are quite unsavory and that most of us wouldn't want to read at all. But say if you were to try to understand alt-right online communities, that would be a necessary thing you need to do, right? Because many of the ideas, the concepts, the ideological elements these people are mobilizing there, right, are something that is not immediately visible in the specific post, but is more in the background, in the shared readings, in the shared films these people have watched, or in the shared kind of cultural reference that people are using. So I realized that time is, that I need to finish soon, but let me just say perhaps the spirit of this is not, again, to counterpose qualitative and quantitative analysis, or say the big data analysis is not necessary. I mean, this could be something that one does in the preliminary stages of a large project, where one is looking at very large data sets and one has to establish the categories, right, that people want to explore, or try to understand what are actually the key terms used there, and then use whatever natural language processing software to explore them also quantitatively. But all in all, my impression is that what lets down some quantitative research on social media is the lack of a sufficient preparatory work, which by its nature is qualitative. Right? In any good quantitative research, we have a good preparatory stage, which by its nature would be profoundly qualitative. Therefore, I think that we need to abandon this idea that big data analysis forecloses the need for interpretation. If anything, this overabundance of information makes interpretive processes and interpretive methodologies all the more important.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Great. Thank you. So, yeah, when you were referring to that phrase, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, it did take me back to the early era of optimism and the culture around the early internet of the 1990s, when, you know, I've actually been delving into that area a bit, going back to, in part, where I started and where the internet started, with this idea of setting up different kinds of social structures through technology. And then when you're mentioning the disproportionate influence that some people have on these social networks, it's kind of replicating inequality, or these you know, social structures that we don't want are being replicated in social media now 25 years later or so. I mean, something I was interested in, and I'll open this up to my colleagues in the audience who are interested in asking you questions, but something I was interested in is the research approach that you're talking about, which is to take small representative samples or even individuals to drill into for qualitative research. Also sounds a bit like how public relations companies such as Bell Pottinger, for example, in the South African example, or even Facebook themselves, can leverage individuals, you know, within these social networks. So this idea of identifying small groups, small numbers of people distributed across known types within the networks. You know, I think Facebook ran those experiments where they were seeing how much they could influence the wider communities around those people by targeting particular individuals. So there's an interesting kind of reflection in looking from a research perspective at choosing small samples as a way of seeing the whole. And then if you want to influence the whole, you can actually work that way through as well by targeting small samples. So perhaps, perhaps if you have any comments in response to that, and then I'll take questions or comments from the audience.
Yes, I think that there is part an illusion that was there at in the pioneering phase of the web, the sort of idea of the web as a new frontier, as a new Wild West, and the corner shop internet, or the amateur internet. I mean, the idea that the on-page internet, right? That everyone can have an on-page, and everyone can be whatever, an artisan on the internet. The idea that the internet would have led to the small producer internet, which perhaps was true in 1995, 1996, or I mean later on, but then as being completely smashed as a narrative by the emergence of enormous global corporations, right, which are now the biggest in the world. And yeah, I don't know much about the kind of the case of the PR firm in South Africa you're referring to, but say, for example, a very interesting research some colleagues of mine did was looking at the UK elections by focusing on the Twitter accounts of MPs and incumbent candidates. So obviously, in an election, candidates will, by nature, have more visibility than ordinary citizens. Obviously, it is not the entire picture, right? But it acknowledges the fact that there are power structures, right? And there are differences in political capital there, and that those people have more preeminence in economic visibility, economic potential.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And do I have any questions from the group here? I know that there are a few people here who this is their area, such as Chikezi. In fact, I think I directed Paolo to your work, Chikezi, when we were first in communication. And I know that he was interested in what you were doing. Yeah, please go ahead. Is video possible for you, or are you non-videoable?
Yeah, I think I can manage. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ralph. And hello, Paolo. Fascinating presentation. Thank you. I'm a researcher in the area of digital media and social media. So yes, and I've done work around political communication, but using social media data to analyze political communication that happens in the digital space. So, but my question is often the one that some of us who are qualitative researchers ask, and it stems from the point which you rightly made, that the data from social media and or digital media is so big that the sheer size can often pose a challenge for qualitative researchers, even quantitative researchers, to grapple with. And so part of that challenge is in the area of sampling, like you mentioned. But I'm also thinking now, what do you think then about the argument, the argument around empiricism and positivism in research about representativeness, how the sample of your analysis should be representative enough to speak to the broader data or the broader landscape that you're researching? What do you have to say about representativeness of qualitative research in using social media data, and how we can argue that as qualitative researchers? My second question is in the area of what is my second question? Yes, the close reading of the texts that you mentioned towards the end of your presentation. I was wondering, what are there specific methods that you recommend for the close reading of social media or social media texts? Like, are there specific methods that you recommend? I know you call it close reading, but are there specific research methods that are appropriate for engaging with such data, and why would you recommend those? Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, on the question of representativeness, which I think is obviously very important, right? Because especially for quantitative research, right, in social science, you need to say, I'm looking at this, which stands for that. Actually, with some big data analysis, actually, this was actually the interpretation of Chris Anderson, is that you don't need to do that anymore, because you're not looking at the sample, you're looking at the population, as you were. Right? So you're directly, say, you're looking at the population of Trump supporters on Twitter by looking at the MAGA hashtag. Say, right? This would be the idea that therefore it is not even representative. It is just that, right, that you're studying. But that is hardly the case, because we know that, and I think big data analysts know that very well, social media data is dirty, so to speak, in the sense that you get a lot of bots, or people trolling, or people using hashtag ironically, or perhaps the hashtag may be important within a community, but it's not exhaustive, right? It's not just the only thing that the community uses. Actually, as we know, hashtags in younger generations are becoming ever less popular. It's almost becoming a kind of boomer marker to use hashtags, as people are not using that much anymore, right, in online conversations. And so there, in a way, the question of representativeness is not solved in the usual ways, right? That you would find in sociological methods, sociological research. And the question was also what is data anyway representative of? Is it representative of the conversation? But if so, how do we find the boundaries of the conversation? Right? Because obviously, if we're trying to analyze a phenomenon, in a way, we are bound to say, I consider this system to contain these and not to contain other things, right? Because there are always, in any system, for example, hashtags that are lateral, right, to a certain conversation. And therefore, it's always quite an arbitrary decision to say, these are the hashtags I'm going to look at, for example. With close reading, I think there's different methods, right, that can be used. There is always a kind of semiotic analysis, which is more concerned with the text itself, how it is organized internally, how it is structured, how different parts hold together in the text. And this is something that I've been cultivated in, as in Italy was very trendy still in the 90s and 2000s, semiotics, now semiotic theory. Now it's not that much anymore. discourse analysis is instead more flexible. It has more to do with, in a way, understanding that certain terms, how terms ramify, are part of different semantic families, and more generally, what is the genealogy of certain terms and how they are connected to various political and social institutions. So there's actually no lack of methodological texts that are actually looking precisely at these issues. So much of it is quite, in a way, quite commonsensical, right? The way you do it, in a sense, is kind of selecting a number of posts and really trying to work out what is distinctive ultimately in terms of language, in terms of imagery, in terms of expression, perhaps in terms of the emotional tone. Right? So if you think about Trump's tweets, they will have a kind of almost signature element to them. They are quite formulaic in the way we don't see them anymore, right? Because it was banned a few months ago from Twitter, but they had this quite formulaic structure always, right? Kind of, this is the issue I'm talking about. These are what those idiots of the left are saying about it, right? And final sentence, bad, sad, or like with an exclamation mark. Actually, for example, looking at this rhetorical structure is interesting in and of itself, right? Because it shows what Trump is trying to do. And what he's trying to do, unlike other right-wing leaders, is creating a sense of outrage, like ridiculing the opponent, vilifying the opponent, and so on and so forth.
Great. Thank you, Paolo. I mean, I'm sure that Trump bots exist. You know, yeah, we can have it wouldn't even require an AI, I would say, to make a Trump tweeter. But thank you for that response. And Chikezi says he's very satisfied with your responses and the messages here. I'm going to ask Babacar, who I know wants to ask a question. Babacar, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Ralph, and thank you, Paolo, for this interesting and indeed very inspiring presentation. Like my colleague Chikezi, I'm also interested at HUMA on the digital humanities and the role of social media and how they impact, for example, social movements like Yanamar and some other social movements. Some 10 years ago, I wrote my first master thesis on Yanamar, Frantz Fanon, and the role of Facebook as a catalyst for spreading news online and then creating communities, because in Facebook now we can have some groups, discussions, stuff like that. I like your idea of contextualization, because sometimes, like you said, researchers, especially Western-based methodology, they don't contextualize. I mean, the local and cultural ideologies that underpin the discussion online, and also the idea that that's what's happening online is a text which is worthy of analysis and study. Because as of today in our universities, especially in Senegal, most researchers, I mean, most people from the university, they think that what's Facebook or those online interaction are not worthy of study. These are just for bad stuff is happening on there, and they don't think we should engage analyzing and trying to make sense of what's happening online. And from a decolonial move, I think that can be a way of deconstructing our curricula and methodologies. I have a question, which is if you, for example, in Senegal, after Yanamar was a social movement that rose up in 2011. Yanamar has been critiqued for many reasons, international capitalism that is being powered in, and then that is sort of spoiling the initial initiative, which is understandable. But now activists are using the local languages, even the names of the new social movement. Social movement like Ar Lu Bok, which means preserving the common, the idea of the common, right? Or Nyo Lank, we refuse, whatever, extra. So people are using the local languages to interact among themselves online. And so I think scholars based on the continent, or scholars who speak the local languages, are better equipped to interact and to make sense of those happening. But also the tensions thereon. How should the researcher, because you have to be present, if you want to follow what's happening, you have to be there 24/7, and it takes time. It is time consuming. Not only you have to be there, but you have to engage with the people. Don't you think that there are some tension there between the researcher and the subject that he or she is interacting with? And because online people are saying from literature, the idea of authorship, the idea of authority is being flattened out. So don't you think that there is something happening in terms of tensions, the horizontality of it, and then the author, being stripped of her of his authority? Thank you.
Thanks, Babacar.
Thanks so much for your question, Babacar. First and foremost, on the question of relevance, I think that, yes, it's true that many colleagues still look at these as something, whatever, irrelevant or trivial. It's a bit like a long-standing prejudice, or say almost kind of superstition, that people have more generally towards kind of humanities and social sciences, right? Until recently, and still now, the Tories in Britain like calling media studies like Mickey Mouse degrees, only to discover then that actually these things matter because they determine so much of our social life. And in terms of politics, so much of consensus mobilization, opinion formation happens online, like it or not, without judging it. Happens on YouTube, happens on Facebook, happens on Twitter, increasingly happens on TikTok and other video sharing platforms. So I think that, and for people like me that have been in the field for some time, it feels anything. when I did my PhD, starting in 2005, it really felt like studying something that was quite parochial and marginal. You see what I mean? Like looking at social media and the internet protest. And then bit by bit, it has been swallowing. Now nobody can talk about politics without talking about social media, right? But then on the other questions that you were raising, okay, the first question that I think is fundamental, local knowledge, local expertise, area studies knowledge, and also kind of avoiding these tendencies where global north researchers sometimes think they can study everything without ever going there, or without knowing the language, or without, right? Unfortunately, this publish or perish tendency of academia pushes people a bit to do that, in the sense that whenever there is a crisis and emergency, immediately jumping on it, on the bandwagon. Right? But that produces quite low quality research. High quality research instead tends to be something that is produced by people who actually have local knowledge, have an understanding also of the people who are involved, right? With the people who are behind the conversations. How the people, for example, are launching trending topics, because trending topics are often manufactured. They are actually created by activists to come together and do that. To look a bit at the backstage, right? The backstage, sorry, right, of what is happening is often very interesting, because you really understand the kind of process behind, the strategy behind. On the last question regarding how you say, contradictions between subject and object, and that is also true in the sense that yes, it's difficult to detach yourself from your position. So, for example, analyzing a conversation and being yourself involved in, right? Or then obviously the ethical questions of whether one can participate in a conversation or in a phenomenon study at the same time. But perhaps when it comes to those, these are quite familiar sociological methods questions, right? In the sense what it means to be objective, which I think has to be, to some extent, an aim, but knowing that objectivity is always subjective, as it were, in the sense that it is always from a specific vantage point, right? And recognizing and admitting that you're looking at that from that specific perspective, and perhaps with some element of a social and political agenda, which there's nothing wrong with, right? And sometimes is it's better to adopt this position rather than to be a sort of white vest social researcher with no investment affecting or political whatsoever.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I also see that Tanya Bosch is in the room, and Tanya is a senior academic in our department who also engages with these questions. So I don't know if Tanya, if you're there, if you have any comment or question, please feel free.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. No, nothing from me at this stage, but thanks, Paolo. I'm a big fan of your work and really enjoying the contributions in the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tanya.
Great, thanks, Tanya. Is there any closing questions or comments here? We have a few minutes, 5 minutes or so. Let's see. I think that people are satisfied. Babacar says satisfied with your response as well. So
Babacar, you're based in Senegal, or are you also based there? Cape Town?
Yes, I'm based in Senegal currently, but I'm working for Huma.
Best food in the world.
Yeah, that's true.
I've been to Dakar, and I.
Oh, really?
I still have nostalgias.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Nice.
Yeah,
so basically, Human is based in Cape Town, but you have a lot of collaborations across Africa. Am I correct?
Right.
Yeah,
right.
It's a Pan-African research station, research institute based in Cape Town. But yeah, we have researchers all over the continent and from all over the continent. And I think you'd be entering hot territory if we were to start to discuss food in detail at the moment. But, no,
as an Italian, if you start putting pineapple on pizzas, it'd be upset.
Yes, I'm hoping to go to Dakar next year myself for the Biennale, so also very excited about that. Thank you very much, Paolo. That's been great, and yeah, we really value your contribution here. So thank you for your generosity. Attire is taking a break for a few weeks. It's the UCT student vacation coming up, and so we won't be here for the next few weeks. But we'll see you after that. Please check the humor.uct.ac.za website under events, and you'll see more about what we do. And we also have other event series that are running as well. So thank you very much. Thanks to my director, Divine. Thanks to my colleagues who are in attendance and who are asking questions and making comments and bringing their knowledge. And thanks again, Paolo.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.